There's one thing Americans can agree on. We value democracy. And in a democracy, leaders are elected by the people to represent the people's interests. One person, one vote.
Right off the bat, we have a huge error. America is not, nor has it ever been, a democracy. Are democratic principles present in the electoral process of the republic? Yes. But democracy is simply majority rule. As I've said in the past, democracy is best described as two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. One person, one vote simply means that 51% of the population can vote to violate the rights of the other 49%. And as Plato so aptly wrote more than 2,000 years ago, tyranny naturally arises out of democracy. No one who values freedom and individual rights should have anything good to say about democracy.
So, why does everyone agree that the government doesn't really work for us?
Because it can't. Government is nothing but a group of people, and like all people, they work in their own self-interest. When you give certain people special authority that doesn't apply to anyone else, they will inevitably use that authority to improve circumstances for themselves, not for others. Further, since the people is nothing but a collection of individuals, all of whom have their own wants and needs, even if there were, theoretically, a completely selfless, altruistic government, they would never be able to satisfy everyone's unique wants and desires.
Conservatives have an easy answer. Big government is the problem. They say the government infringes on people's freedoms and is constantly getting bigger. They say that if we just defund expensive government programs, we could lower taxes for the average American. With that money back in the hands of ordinary people, they say, people could handle their problems on their own.
For the record, most conservatives I know are perfectly fine with a large, intrusive government, so long as the government is using its power to restrict freedoms in the way that they want it to, such as banning recreational drugs, porn, and flag burning. But setting that aside, this statement is demonstrably true. Government, by definition, obtains its revenue through coercive taxation, not voluntary transaction, which means that in order for it to exist, it must necessarily violate the rights of its citizens. And since government is nothing but a group of people, its efforts to serve its own interests necessarily result in it growing bigger over time. You never spend someone else's money as efficiently as you spend your own, which means that even in a best-case scenario, there would be no difference between how the government spent money compared to how those citizens would have spent it if they had just kept it.
But there's a big problem with that. It's just not true.
Let me guess. The problems we've endlessly had with big government are only because the wrong people were in charge, right? I mean, big government has never worked before because all our politicians were corrupt. But this new guy, if we just let this new guy take over, all the problems will be solved. Who wants to bet that's her solution?
Sure, the US government is big, but not as big as it used to be. As a percentage of the economy, federal spending is smaller now than it was in 1954.
This is what we call cherry-picking data. In the right-hand corner, we can see that Ms. Gray cited usgovernmentspending.com as her source for this claim. Well, what exactly does usgovernmentspending.com have to say about the size of government as determined by government spending over time? Quote, back in 1900, government spending was a modest affair. Government pensions were almost non-existent. Healthcare was 0.26% of GDP. Education was 1.1% of GDP. Defense was 1.6% of GDP. And welfare was 0.11% of GDP. Over a century later, in 2018, the 5 major functions dominate government spending in the United States. Government pensions, 6.7% GDP. Healthcare, 7.77% GDP. Education, 5.32% GDP. Defense, 4.2% GDP. Welfare, other than healthcare, 2.16% GDP. That is 26% of GDP out of the total government spending of 34.9% GDP. Back in 1900, all government programs other than pensions, healthcare, education, defense, and welfare amounted to 4.6% of GDP. Today, police, fire, infrastructure, and all the rest take 9.1% of GDP. In other words, government spending has consistently increased over time, and while the amount of money spent as a percentage of GDP fluctuates, what really determines the size of government is not simply what percentage of GDP is spent, but how much real spending occurs, and what that money is spent on. When you consider this question, the very source that Miss Gray tried to use to substantiate her claim overwhelmingly confirms that real government spending has consistently grown over time, and that the government functions on which it spends the money represent far larger government involvement in what were previously private affairs. You can't just pick two random years on the chart, compare them, and say that because as a percentage of GDP, government spending was lower in 2020 than in 1954, therefore government has gotten smaller over time. While technically true, this is a blatant misrepresentation of what the data shows.
And the US spends less on government than other countries, like Germany or Finland, that have lower rates of poverty and higher rates of economic mobility.
This is also a blatant manipulation of the data. Notice that the source she cites for this data is the OECD. But the OECD assigns rates of poverty to individual nations based on the percentage of people in that nation who make less than half of the median income for that nation. Since different nations have different median incomes, it's not hard to see that there can be no meaningful comparison of the poverty rates between these countries based on how they are assigned by the OECD. To put things in perspective, according to the OECD, the US has a higher poverty rate than Mexico. However, 35% of Mexico's population earns less than $5.50 per day, which is less than the 1-hour federal minimum wage in the US. In fact, despite the fact that government spending is higher in most European countries, like the ones Ms. Gray cited, the poorest 20% in the US actually have greater material wealth than most of the people who would be considered middle class in those European countries. It's true what they say. Statistics don't lie, but liars use statistics.
The American dream is more alive in these big government countries than in America.
As I just demonstrated, this is abjectly false. How can that be if the poorest 20% of Americans have greater material wealth than the middle class in these European nations?
And there's no truth to the claim that the bigger the government, the less free the people. In fact, the countries at the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, ranks as freer than the United States, countries like Sweden or Denmark have much larger governments relative to their populations than the United States. A large government doesn't mean an unfree population.
That's because those countries are significantly freer in that they face fewer economic regulations and market barriers. Most of those countries cited don't even have a government-mandated minimum wage. They readily embrace free trade and have comparatively low corporate tax rates. Yes, they have larger welfare states than the US, but to know how big a government is, you can't simply compare bulk spending as a percentage of GDP. You have to look at what the government is spending the money on and what measures the government takes to restrict the otherwise free actions of its citizens. Besides, who really gets to decide what government is big and what government is small? People are either free to make their own decisions and do what they want with their own money, or they aren't. Governments inevitably grow over time. I challenge you to give me one example of a historical government whose spending trended downward over time and who closed down government agencies that were deemed extraneous.
You see, government isn't a problem in and of itself. In a country as sprawling and diverse as America, there needs to be an institution to build infrastructure and inspect food and to put out fires. to do things that help our communities, even if they don't turn a profit.
What you're effectively saying is, it's impossible for infrastructure to be built, fires to be put out, and food to be inspected unless one body with a monopoly on force steals from its citizens in order to fund these activities. There is absolutely no reason why private organizations would be incapable of fulfilling these functions. Remember, the thing that makes a government is the fact that it funds itself through coercive taxation and not through voluntary transaction. In fact, as we're about to see, the very examples Ms. Gray will try to use to prove her point will in fact prove it wrong.
Think of the U.S. Postal Service, which provides hundreds of thousands of good jobs while allowing people to cheaply mail packages across the country. Or think of Medicare and Medicaid, which are credited with having saved millions of lives.
You're apparently unfamiliar with the American Letter Mail Company and Lysander Spooner. Founded in 1844, this private organization delivered the mail so much quicker and cheaper than the U.S. Postal Service that the only way the Postal Service was able to save itself from destruction was to use the power of government to forcibly shut Spooner's organization down. As for Medicare and Medicaid, far from saving lives, these programs have radically increased healthcare costs across the board, leading to an increasingly bureaucratic and complicated system where doctors spend more time filling out government-mandated paperwork than they actually do treating patients. See my video collaboration with Shane Killian to learn more.
So, the problem isn't the size of government, it's who controls the government.
Did I not predict it, folks? Tell us, Ms. Gray, if the people who run the government have screwed it up so badly all this time, who is it that we're supposed to give the controls to? Point out this totally selfless, altruistic group of people to me.
The reason it feels like our politicians don't work for us is because, well, they don't. Republicans and Democrats alike are working for the people who line their wallets instead.
Yes, but I suppose there exists some other group of people who won't do this, right? Where are these people who just won't be influenced by money once we give them the reins of power?
That's not just my politics. That's the academic consensus. In 2014, a Princeton University study found that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy. More than that, they found that the desires of regular people have zero impact on policy adoption. Not a little impact, not barely any impact, no relationship at all.
People act in their own self-interest, and government is nothing but a group of people. When you give government special privileges that no one else has, like the ability to use force against otherwise peaceful people, it's no surprise that government uses this power to better its own interests, not the interests of this nebulous, non-existent group called the people. No matter who you put in office, this basic reality will never change. The problem is not the people running government. The problem is the incentives those people have based on the perceived legitimacy of government using coercive force.
And it's a truth that has been understood since the founding of the United States. Thomas Jefferson wrote of his desire to crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations. But blinded by swanky dinner parties and big donations, some politicians have forgotten his words.
Jefferson was far closer to an anarcho-capitalist than just about any other of the founding fathers. So if the purpose of this video was to defend big government, I'm curious why you're defending him. Read the Federalist Papers. Jefferson was not afraid of corporations themselves, but rather of a government that could be bought off by those corporations. He understood that without a strong coercive government, those corporations would have no power in and of themselves.
The top ranks of both parties today are filled with billionaires, banking executives, and wealthy lobbyists. Corporations regularly give money to politicians on both sides of the aisle, guaranteeing their influence no matter who wins an election. Whoever wins, you lose.
And the only reason for this is because there exists a strong government that can be bought off in the first place. I mean, for crying out loud, you admit that both parties are equally corrupt. So where is this other, incorruptible, totally selfless group of people? You're making my point for me.
With a government under the control of corporations and the rich, the system has been rigged completely in their favor. In the 1950s, when the economy was growing faster than ever, the richest people in the country paid an income tax of 91%. The corporate income tax was above 50%. But after decades of tax cuts for the rich, the 400 richest Americans pay a lower tax rate than the bottom 10%.
Again, manipulated data. Remember how Ms. Gray was so eager to compare government spending as a percentage of GDP? Well, it's worth noting that despite radical fluctuations in tax rates and an increasingly complicated tax code, the government is collecting roughly the same amount of tax money today as it was back in the 50s, as a percentage of GDP. Are you seriously prepared to argue that life was better for everyone back in the 1950s, much less that the reason for it was because the rich paid a higher marginal tax rate? Today, the top 1% of taxpayers still pay a greater share of individual income taxes than the bottom 90% combined, so don't lecture me about the rich not paying their fair share.
Corporations, elites, and the politicians they control will justify this inequality by saying that different rules for them mean more wealth for all. But recent history shows that's not the case. While American workers have become dramatically more productive, their wages have stagnated or fallen. The average hourly wage was higher in 1974 than it was in 2018. This has led to a stark gap in qualities of life. From 1989 to 2018, the wealthiest 1% of Americans increased their total net worth by $21 trillion. The bottom 50%, meanwhile, saw their net worth decrease by $900 billion.
This couldn't have anything to do with the fact that the government constantly printing money devalues the currency that the American workers have worked so hard to save, could it? Remember, net worth is the total value of everything a person owns, not to be confused with liquid wealth, which is the total amount of cash they have on hand. By inflating the currency, the government is constantly ensuring that those wealthier individuals who own material assets like houses and immaterial assets like stocks will see the value of those assets constantly increasing, nominally anyways, while lower-income wage workers will constantly see the real purchasing power of their earnings decrease. Whose fault is this? Oh yeah, the government, the only entity with the power to issue money and mandate its use by force.
The rich got richer, the poor got poorer.
It's more accurate to say that the rich kept what they already had, and the government funneled more real wealth into its own hands through currency manipulation. The people who got burned were the ones trying to save their currency so as to improve their lives.
For too long, we have been presented with a false choice: big government versus small government. We're right to be skeptical of the people who lead us. They don't work for you or for me, but it's not because government is big. It's because it's bought. I'm Briahna Gray, contributing editor at Current Affairs magazine for the Gravel Institute.
So that's it? Ms. Gray, who are the people that we're supposed to put in charge of government? You said that the problem is that big government is bought, but nowhere did you tell us where we can find the leaders who are immune to being bought. If there is no government, then there is no one for the corporations to buy. Did I miss something? Or did this video actually prove that big government is indeed the problem? And that is my 2 cents. Take it for what it's worth. This video was selected on the basis of a patron request. Reminder that all patrons who pledge $15 a month or more on Patreon or Subscribestar are guaranteed to have their video requests made. Thanks everyone for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, as well as hit the bell to receive notifications so that you never miss an upload. And if you're a fan of my channel, please consider supporting me on Subscribestar, Bitbacker, or Patreon to receive special rewards. All links can be found in the About section of my website, my2centsvideos.com.